The phone rang at 2:47 in the afternoon on a Tuesday that I thought would be like any other. I was sitting in my small apartment kitchen stirring honey into my tea when the caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. "Is this Mrs. Eleanor Whitman?" the voice asked, crisp and professional. "Yes, this is Eleanor." "Mrs. Whitman, this is Margaret Chen from Pemberton Auction House. I'm calling about some items that were consigned to us recently under your name. There's been quite a development regarding their authentication and valuation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." My hand trembled slightly as I set down my teacup. The antiques. The collection my daughter Sandra had insisted were nothing but dusty relics taking up space. The pieces she'd practically forced me to sell just 3 months ago, claiming they were worthless junk that no one would ever want. "Mrs. Whitman, are you still there?" "Yes, I'm here," I managed to say, though my voice felt far away. "Ma'am, I think you should come in. We need to discuss this in person." As I hung up the phone, I stared at the empty corners of my apartment where my treasures used to sit. The silence felt different now, charged with possibility. After 68 years of being told I was foolish, sentimental, and naive about the value of old things, someone was finally taking me seriously. But to understand how I got to this moment, sitting alone in a sparse apartment with nothing but memories and regret, you need to know how it all began. You need to know about the woman I used to be, before my own daughter convinced me I was nothing more than a hoarder clinging to worthless relics. My love affair with antiques began when I was 7 years old, standing in my grandmother's attic on a rainy Saturday afternoon in 1962. Grandma Rose lived in a sprawling Victorian house in Salem, Oregon, where every room held secrets and every piece of furniture had a story. While other children my age were content with toys and television, I was enchanted by the way sunlight danced through vintage crystal, how carved wood felt smooth under my small fingers, and the mysterious lives that old objects seemed to whisper about. "Eleanor, darling," Grandma Rose would say, her voice soft but filled with passion. "These aren't just things. They're pieces of human stories. This music box belonged to a young woman who danced at the Portland Rose Festival in 1923. This china set survived the journey from Ireland when your great-great-grandmother came to America with nothing but hope and determination." Grandma Rose taught me to see beyond the surface. She showed me how to identify different periods of furniture by examining the joints and hardware. She explained why certain pottery glazes could tell you not just when something was made, but where. Under her patient guidance, I learned to spot the difference between genuine craftsmanship and mass-produced imitations. Most importantly, she taught me that collecting wasn't about accumulating objects. It was about preserving history and honoring the people who came before us. When Grandma Rose passed away during my junior year of college, she left me her entire collection. My parents, practical people who valued function over form, didn't understand why I would want all that old stuff, but they respected her wishes. I spent that entire summer carefully cataloging each piece, researching their origins, and finding the perfect spots for them in my small apartment near Portland State University. My collection became my companion through my 20s and 30s. While my friends were buying modern furniture and chasing the latest trends, I was haunting estate sales, antique shops, and auction houses. I had an eye for finding treasures that others overlooked. A Roseville pottery vase at a garage sale for $5 that I later learned was worth several hundred. A set of sterling silver candlesticks tarnished black that the seller thought were plate, but turned out to be genuine Georg Jensen pieces from the 1940s. I wasn't wealthy. I worked as a librarian at the county library system, a job that paid modestly, but gave me access to research resources and flexible hours for my treasure hunting. Every purchase was carefully considered. Every dollar spent on antiques was a dollar saved from somewhere else. I ate simple meals, wore clothes until they were beyond repair, and drove the same reliable Honda for 15 years. But my apartment was a museum of beauty and history that filled my soul in ways that material, luxury never could. When I met Robert Whitman at a library conference in 1987, I was 32 and completely content with my life. Robert was an accountant, steady and kind, with laugh lines around his eyes and a gentle way of listening that made me feel heard. He didn't share my passion for antiques, but he respected it. He would accompany me to estate sales on weekends, carrying boxes and offering his practical perspective on purchases. "Are you sure about that armoire, Ellie?" he might ask, not dismissively, but with genuine concern for our budget. "It's beautiful, but where will we put it?" I loved that he called me Ellie. I loved that he never made me feel foolish for seeing magic in old things. When we married in 1989, combining our households was like orchestrating a careful dance. Robert's functional modern furniture and my antique treasures somehow found harmony in our small ranch house on Maple Street. Sandra was born in 1992, a healthy, energetic baby who grew into a curious toddler. I loved showing her my collection, explaining the stories behind each piece, just as Grandma Rose had done for me. I hoped she would develop the same appreciation for history and beauty, the same ability to see beyond the surface of things. But Sandra was different from me in fundamental ways. Where I saw stories, she saw clutter. Where I found beauty in patina and age, she preferred things shiny and new. As she grew older, these differences became more pronounced. She was drawn to technology, to things that were efficient and streamlined. She excelled in school, particularly in mathematics and science, showing the same practical mindset as her father, but with an intensity that sometimes worried me. "Mom, why do you need so many old dishes?" she would ask as a teenager, gesturing dismissively at my china cabinet filled with different sets from various eras. "We can only eat off one plate at a time." I tried to explain about the craftsmanship, the history, the artistry involved in hand-painted porcelain from the 1890s versus the elegant simplicity of mid-century modern ceramics. But Sandra would roll her eyes and retreat to her room, where everything was organized, minimal, and decidedly contemporary. Robert acted as a buffer between us during those years. He understood both perspectives and helped us navigate our differences with patience and humor. When Sandra complained about the old junk taking up space, he would gently remind her that these were important to me. When I felt hurt by her dismissiveness, he would point out that she was young and would perhaps appreciate these things more when she was older. "Everyone has to find their own path to beauty, Ellie," he would say, holding me close on nights when Sandra's criticism stung more than usual. "Just because hers looks different from yours doesn't mean either of you is wrong." Those were good years, despite the growing tension around my collecting. Sandra graduated valedictorian from high school and earned a full scholarship to study business at Oregon State University. Robert's accounting practice was thriving, and we were finally able to afford the larger house we'd dreamed of. A 1920s craftsman-style home with built-in cabinets perfect for displaying my collection, and enough rooms that Sandra could have her own space exactly the way she wanted it. I spent months planning how to arrange my antiques in the new house. Each piece was carefully placed to show its best features, while contributing to the overall harmony of the room. The dining room showcased my formal china sets and crystal glasses. The living room featured my collection of vintage lamps and a stunning mahogany secretary desk from the 1880s. Even the bathrooms had carefully chosen period-appropriate accessories that transformed functional spaces into elegant retreats. For the first time in years, I felt like my passion had a proper home. Friends who visited would spend hours asking about different pieces, admiring the craftsmanship and marveling at the stories behind various items. I started hosting small gatherings for other antique enthusiasts, and our home became known in local collector circles as a place where history lived and breathed. Sandra, now in college, seemed less critical of the collection when she brought friends home. Perhaps it was because the larger house didn't feel cluttered, or maybe she was beginning to mature and see things differently. She even showed a few pieces to her roommates, pointing out details I had taught her years earlier about pottery marks and furniture construction techniques. "My mom knows everything about old stuff," I heard her tell a friend one evening. It wasn't exactly enthusiasm, but it wasn't mockery either. I took it as progress. Robert and I settled into a comfortable rhythm during those years. He handled our finances while I managed the household and continued building my collection, though more selectively now. We took weekend trips to antique districts in neighboring states, turning my hobby into shared adventures. We would plan our vacations around estate sales and antique shows, creating memories that were enhanced by the treasures we discovered together. But life has a way of changing course when you least expect it. Robert's first heart attack came on a Thursday morning in March 2019. He was 58 years old, seemingly healthy, working in his office when he collapsed. The paramedics said he was lucky. The quick response time and the proximity to the hospital saved his life. The cardiologist explained that he would need to make significant lifestyle changes, take medication, and avoid stress. The second heart attack, just 14 months later, was massive and sudden. There was no warning, no time for goodbyes. I found him in his office chair, peaceful, as if he had simply fallen asleep while reviewing client files. The paramedics said he wouldn't have suffered, that it happened too quickly for pain or fear. At 65, I was suddenly alone in our beautiful house filled with all my treasures, and for the first time in my life, they felt like exactly what Sandra had always called them. Just things. Old, silent things that couldn't fill the enormous space Robert's absence had created. Sandra handled the funeral arrangements with the same efficiency she brought to everything else. She flew home from Seattle, where she now worked for a major consulting firm, and took charge of details I was too grief-stricken to manage. She was kind, but distant, treating me like a client who needed professional assistance rather than a mother who had lost her husband and best friend. In the months following Robert's death, I struggled to find my footing. The house felt too big, too quiet, too full of memories. I would sit in Robert's chair and stare at my collections, trying to recapture the joy they once brought me. But without someone to share the stories with, without Robert's gentle presence and appreciation, they seemed diminished somehow. Sandra visited more frequently during those first months, checking on me with the same careful attention she gave to her work projects. She would arrive with lists of things I needed to address: insurance paperwork, financial planning, home maintenance issues. She was helpful in practical ways, but there was a coldness to her efficiency that made me feel more alone than comforted. "Mom, you need to think about downsizing," she said during one of these visits, looking around the dining room with its china cabinets and display cases. "This house is too much for you to maintain, and honestly, all this stuff is just going to be a burden when you get older." I bristled at her dismissive tone, the same attitude she'd had toward my collection since childhood. "These aren't stuff, Sandra. They're pieces of history, family heirlooms, things I've spent decades collecting and caring for." She sighed, the patient sigh of someone dealing with an unreasonable person. "Mom, I know they mean something to you, but you have to be realistic." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I live in Seattle. I travel constantly for work. When something happens to you, I'll be stuck dealing with all of this. Do you have any idea how much work it would be to dispose of this much? Inventory? The word inventory hit me like a slap. These weren't business assets to be liquidated. They were my life's passion, my connection to history, my legacy from Grandma Rose. But I could see in Sandra's eyes that she genuinely believed she was being practical and caring. In her world, efficiency and simplicity were virtues, and my collection represented the opposite of everything she valued. That conversation planted a seed of doubt that grew stronger over the following months. Every time I looked at my beautiful things, I heard Sandra's voice asking what would happen to them when I was gone. Every time I dusted a delicate figurine or polished a piece of silver, I wondered if I was being selfish to burden my daughter with my passions. The doubt became a constant companion, whispering questions that had never occurred to me before. Was I holding on to the past in unhealthy ways? Was my collection really just an elaborate form of hoarding? Were all these beautiful objects actually worthless sentiment disguised as sophistication? By the time Sandra made her next visit 6 months later, I was ready to listen to her suggestions about downsizing. I was tired of second-guessing myself, tired of feeling guilty about my life's passion, tired of living alone with things that no longer seemed to spark joy. What I didn't realize was that this was exactly what Sandra had been waiting for. The moment when grief and isolation would make me vulnerable enough to agree to what she had wanted all along. The moment when I would stop defending my treasures and start seeing them through her eyes as nothing more than obstacles to a simpler, more manageable life. The woman who had once stood in Grandma Rose's attic, enchanted by stories and beauty, was about to let her own daughter convince her that those stories didn't matter, and that beauty was just another word for clutter. Sandra arrived on a crisp October morning in 2021, her rental car pulling into the driveway with the precision of someone who had planned every detail of her visit. She stepped out wearing a charcoal business suit and carrying a leather portfolio that I recognized as the same one she used for client presentations. This wasn't going to be a casual mother-daughter visit, and we both knew it. "Hi, Mom," she said, giving me a brief hug that felt more like a business greeting than familial affection. "You look tired. Are you sleeping okay?" I wasn't sleeping. Well, hadn't been since Robert died, but I didn't want to give her more ammunition for the conversation I suspected was coming. "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just adjusting to the changing seasons. You know how the shorter days affect me." She nodded absently, already scanning the living room with the calculating gaze I'd seen her use when evaluating corporate inefficiencies. Her eyes lingered on my display of carnival glass that caught the morning light beautifully, then moved to the collection of vintage perfume bottles arranged on the mantel, and finally settled on the mahogany secretary desk where I kept my most treasured correspondence and documents. "Mom, we need to talk," she said, setting her portfolio on the coffee table with a decisive thud. "I've been thinking a lot about your situation here, and I'm worried about you." I gestured toward the kitchen. "Let me make some coffee first. I have that hazelnut blend you used to like." "I don't drink flavored coffee anymore," she replied, following me anyway. "Just black, please. Caffeine without unnecessary additives." Even her coffee preferences had become clinical, I thought, measuring grounds into the filter. When had my daughter become so rigid, so determined to strip away anything that wasn't purely functional? I remembered the little girl who used to help me arrange flowers in vintage vases, who would listen with wide eyes as I told her about the families who might have owned these pieces before us. "Mom, I've been doing some research," Sandra began as I poured our coffee. She opened her portfolio and pulled out a thick folder filled with printed pages. "Do you have any idea what it costs to maintain this house? Property taxes, utilities, insurance, maintenance. It's eating up a huge portion of your income." I sat down across from her, wrapping my hands around my coffee mug for warmth and comfort. "I managed just fine, Sandra. The house is paid off, and Robert left me with enough to live comfortably." "Comfortably?" She pulled out a spreadsheet that looked disturbingly detailed. "Mom, Dad's life insurance and retirement savings won't last forever if you keep spending at this rate, and that's not even accounting for potential health issues or long-term care needs." The spreadsheet felt like an invasion of privacy, even though I knew she was trying to help. Every expense was categorized and color-coded: utilities in blue, insurance in red, maintenance in yellow. Even my modest purchases from estate sales were tracked and highlighted in what she'd labeled discretionary, antique spending. "You've been monitoring my finances?" I asked, unable to keep the hurt from my voice. "Dad gave me access to the accounts when he got sick," she explained, her tone softening slightly. He was worried about you managing everything alone. I've just been keeping an eye on things to make sure you're okay. That was news to me. Robert had never mentioned giving Sandra access to our accounts, but then again, there had been so many medical appointments and medications in those final months. Perhaps he'd been more worried about my ability to handle practical matters than he'd let on. The real issue, Sandra continued, pulling out another document, is that you're sitting on a significant asset that's not generating any income. This house is worth at least $400,000 in today's market. If you sold it and moved into a nice senior community, you could invest that money and have a steady income stream for the rest of your life. The phrase senior community made me wince. I was 68, not 90. I was still healthy, still independent, still capable of living in my own home surrounded by the things I loved. But Sandra was presenting her argument with the same persuasive logic she used to convince corporate clients to restructure their operations. And then there's the insurance issue, she said, pulling out yet another document. Do you realize how underinsured this collection is? Most homeowners' policies only cover a few $1,000s for collectibles, unless you have special riders. If there was a fire or a break-in, you'd lose everything and have no way to replace it. This hit harder because it was true. I'd always meant to get the collection properly appraised and insured, but the process seemed overwhelming and expensive. Robert had handled most of our insurance matters, and after his death, I'd been focused on just maintaining what we already had. How much would it cost to insure everything properly? I asked. Sandra consulted her notes. I called several insurance companies for estimates. For a collection of this size and age, you're looking at least $3,000 to $5,000 annually, and that's assuming you can get everything professionally appraised first. That appraisal process alone could cost several $1,000s. The numbers felt crushing. Money that could be spent on necessities was instead going toward protecting objects that my daughter clearly saw as frivolous luxuries. When she laid it out in black and white, my passion suddenly seemed selfish and irresponsible. Mom, I'm not trying to be mean, Sandra said, reaching across the table to pat my hand. I'm trying to be realistic. You could sell this house, get rid of all this stuff that's just creating stress and expense, and move somewhere safe and manageable. There's a beautiful retirement community in Beaverton with assisted living options when you need them. You could make friends, have activities, not worry about maintaining a big house by yourself. The word stuff stung, just as it always had. But this time, instead of defending my collection, I found myself seeing it through her eyes. Was I being foolish to cling to objects when my daughter was offering me a simpler, more secure future? I don't need assisted living, I protested weakly. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. For now, Sandra agreed. But what happens in 5 years? 10 years? What if you fall and break a hip? What if you develop dementia like Grandma Rose did at the end? Do you really want to burden me with having to sort through all of this while also dealing with your care? The mention of Grandma Rose's final years was a low blow, and Sandra knew it. I'd watched my grandmother, the woman who taught me to love beautiful things, forget the stories behind her treasures, and eventually not recognize them at all. In her final months, she'd thrown a tantrum when a nurse tried to dust her prized music box, screaming that strangers were trying to steal her belongings. That's different, I said, but my voice lacked conviction. Is it? Sandra pulled out her phone and showed me a news article. Look at this. Local woman's hoarding situation requires professional cleanup after death. Her children had to hire a company to clear out 40 years of collecting. It took 3 weeks and cost them thousands of dollars just to get the house ready to sell. The article included photos of a house crammed floor to ceiling with newspapers, magazines, and what the caption called various collectibles and antiques. It looked nothing like my carefully curated and maintained collection, but Sandra's point was clear. This is what happens when collecting goes too far, when elderly people hold on to things their children don't understand or value. "Mom, I love you," Sandra said, her voice taking on the patient tone she might use with a difficult client. "I want what's best for you, but you have to admit that maintaining all of this is becoming too much. When was the last time you really enjoyed looking at any of these pieces? When was the last time you felt joy instead of obligation when you were dusting and organizing?" She was right, and that realization hit me like a physical blow. Since Robert's death, caring for my collection had felt more like a burden than a pleasure. The weekly dusting had become a chore that reminded me of how alone I was. The careful maintenance of delicate pieces felt pointless when there was no one to share their beauty with. Even adding new pieces had lost its appeal when there was no one to tell about the excitement of a great find, or the satisfaction of research that revealed a piece's history. "You could keep a few special pieces," Sandra continued, sensing my weakening resolve. "Maybe that jewelry box that belonged to Great-Grandma Rose, or Dad's watch collection. But the bulk of it, the furniture, the china sets, the glassware, it's just taking up space and creating anxiety. You spend more time worrying about protecting it than enjoying it." That afternoon, Sandra took me to visit the retirement community in Beaverton. Rolling Hills Manor was exactly what she'd described: clean, safe, and well-managed. The apartments were spacious by institutional standards, with modern kitchens and bathrooms designed for aging bodies. The common areas were comfortable and filled with residents who seemed content playing cards, watching television, or participating in organized activities. The activities director, a cheerful woman named Patricia, showed us around with the practiced enthusiasm of someone who gave this tour several times a week. There was a craft room where residents made simple projects like greeting cards and painted ceramic figurines. There was a library with large print books and comfortable chairs. There was even a small garden where residents could tend raised beds filled with flowers and vegetables. "We have several residents who are interested in antiques," Patricia told us, leading us past a display case in the lobby that contained a modest collection of vintage items donated by residents. Mrs. Henderson brought her collection of depression glass, and Mr. Torres contributed some lovely Native American pottery. It's wonderful when residents share their treasures with the community. The display case was nice enough, but seeing those few scattered pieces presented as curiosities rather than treasured possessions made my heart sink. Was this what my collection would become? A few representative samples displayed for other people to glance at while passing through the lobby? "What happens to collections that are too large for the apartments?" I asked. "Well, most people find that downsizing is quite liberating," Patricia replied diplomatically. "Our apartments are designed to be low maintenance and clutter-free. Residents often tell us they wish they'd made the transition sooner instead of holding on to so many things they didn't really need." As we toured a model apartment, I tried to imagine my life compressed into these tidy rooms. The living area was pleasant enough, with a small dining table and a comfortable seating arrangement facing a wall-mounted television. The bedroom had a good-sized closet and space for a dresser. There was even a den that could accommodate a desk and some books. But where would I put Grandma Rose's china cabinet? Where would the mahogany secretary desk fit? How could I display even a fraction of my collection in a way that honored their beauty and significance? Of course, storage units are available for items that don't fit in the apartment, Patricia mentioned, as if reading my thoughts. Many residents find it helpful to keep seasonal decorations or extra furniture in storage. Storage units, my life's passion relegated to windowless concrete boxes where beautiful things would sit in the dark, visited only when I needed to retrieve something practical. The thought made me feel physically ill. On the drive back to my house, Sandra kept up a steady stream of practical observations about Rolling Hills Manor. The meals looked nutritious and well-prepared. The staff seemed caring and professional. The location was convenient to shopping and medical facilities. The cost, while significant, was less than I was currently spending on maintaining the house when all expenses were factored in. "And the best part," she said as we pulled into my driveway, "is that I'd have peace of mind knowing you were safe and cared for. Right now, I worry constantly about you being alone in this big house. What if you fell and couldn't reach the phone? What if someone broke in? What if there was a fire?" These were legitimate concerns, I had to admit. The house did feel large and sometimes intimidating when I was alone at night. I'd been putting off some needed repairs because they seemed overwhelming to arrange and supervise by myself. And I'd noticed that I was becoming more forgetful about things like locking doors or turning off appliances. That evening, after Sandra had returned to her hotel, I walked through my house with new eyes. Instead of seeing beauty and history, I found myself noticing dust that had accumulated in hard-to-reach places, scratches on wood surfaces that needed refinishing, and the overwhelming quantity of objects that required constant attention and care. In the dining room, I counted 5 complete sets of china plus numerous individual pieces from different eras. Did one person really need so many dishes? In the living room, I had dozens of decorative objects on every surface, each requiring careful dusting and periodic rearrangement. When had curation become accumulation? I sat in Robert's chair and tried to remember the last time I'd truly enjoyed any of these pieces. When had I last held one of my treasured figurines and felt the joy of its craftsmanship? When had I last researched a piece or shared its story with someone who cared? The honest answer was that I couldn't remember. Maybe Sandra was right. Maybe I was holding on to the past in unhealthy ways, surrounding myself with objects instead of building relationships with people. Maybe what I'd convinced myself was preservation of history was actually just fear of change disguised as appreciation for beauty. The next morning, Sandra returned with coffee and pastries from my favorite bakery, a gesture that felt both loving and strategic. She sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad covered in notes and a calm, determined expression that I recognized from her childhood when she'd decided she wanted something. "Mom, I've been thinking about everything we discussed yesterday," she began, "and I have a proposal that might work for both of us." She outlined a plan that she'd obviously spent considerable time developing. I would put the house on the market immediately to take advantage of strong real estate prices. While it was being shown, I would begin the process of sorting through my collection, keeping only the pieces that had genuine sentimental value or could fit in a smaller living space. "We'll hire a reputable estate sale company to handle most of the collection," she explained. "They'll know how to price things appropriately and attract serious buyers. You won't have to deal with strangers tramping through the house or haggling over prices. It'll be professional and dignified." The word dignified was carefully chosen, I realized. Sandra understood that my concern wasn't just about money, but about my treasures being treated with respect. "And the best part," she continued, "is that we'll have plenty of time to research the really special pieces. If there's anything that might have significant value, we can get it properly appraised and sell it through auction houses that specialize in antiques. You might be surprised how much some of your things are worth." This was a new angle she hadn't mentioned before. Instead of dismissing my collection as worthless, she was now suggesting that some pieces might actually be valuable. It felt like validation, even though I suspected she was just using a different strategy to achieve the same goal. "What about the pieces I want to keep?" I asked. "We'll be very selective," she promised. "Maybe 20 or 30 pieces that really matter to you. Things that will fit nicely in a retirement apartment and won't be overwhelming to maintain. The rest will sell so you have financial security and peace of mind." 20 or 30 pieces out of a collection I'd spent decades building. It felt like being asked to choose which of my children to save in a disaster. But Sandra was presenting it as a generous compromise, a way for me to honor my past while embracing a more practical future. "I know this is hard," she said, reaching. across the table to squeeze my hand. But Mom, you're not getting any younger. This is a chance to take control of your situation instead of waiting for circumstances to force decisions on you. And who knows? You might discover that some of your pieces are worth enough to make the whole process feel like a wonderful windfall instead of a sacrifice. Over the following days, Sandra helped me contact estate sale companies and get estimates for handling my collection. The process was more overwhelming than I'd expected. Each company representative walked through my house with a clipboard, making notes and taking photographs, treating my treasures like inventory to be liquidated. "You have some nice pieces here," said Janet Morrison from Timeless Treasures Estate. "Sales. The furniture should do well, especially the mahogany pieces. Craftsman-era furniture is very popular right now, and this carnival glass collection is substantial. We'll definitely get some serious collectors interested." She paused, in front of my china cabinet, examining the various sets with a practiced eye. The Haviland china will sell, probably in the mid-range for estate sale pricing. The Spode is always popular. This Roseville pottery should do very well. People love the American art pottery. Hearing my beloved pieces discussed in terms of market appeal and pricing categories felt surreal. These weren't just commodities to be sold, they were companions that had brought me decades of joy. But Janet's casual expertise also made me realize how little I actually knew about the monetary value of my collection. Would any of these pieces be worth taking to auction instead of including in the estate sale? I asked. Janet paused, considering. Possibly. You'd want to get a formal appraisal done on some of the higher-end pieces. That secretary desk might be worth more than we could get at an estate sale, depending on its provenance. And some of this art glass could surprise you if it's attributed to the right makers. This was the first time anyone had suggested that my collection might contain pieces of genuine value beyond their emotional significance to me. Sandra perked up immediately, her business instincts engaged by the possibility of higher returns on investment. "How much would it cost to get everything appraised?" Sandra asked. "For a collection this size, you'd probably want to bring in several specialists," Janet explained. "Furniture, ceramics, glassware, silver, they all require different expertise. You're looking at probably $3,000 to $5,000 for comprehensive appraisals, but it could pay for itself if you discover some real treasures." After Janet left, Sandra and I sat in the living room surrounded by my collections, looking at them with new eyes. The possibility that some pieces might be genuinely valuable had shifted the conversation from pure sentiment to potential financial opportunity. "Mom, what if we're sitting on a gold mine?" Sandra asked, her excitement palpable. "What if some of these pieces are worth thousands of dollars? You could afford the very best retirement community, maybe even a luxury senior living facility." The idea was intoxicating. Instead of feeling guilty about spending money on appraisals, I could think of it as an investment. Instead of seeing the sale of my collection as a loss, I could frame it as a smart financial decision that would secure my future. But as the days passed and the reality of the process set in, I began to feel a growing sense of dread. Strangers would soon be walking through my house, handling my treasures, deciding what was worth keeping and what was disposable. The careful arrangements I'd spent years perfecting would be dismantled and scattered to unknown buyers who might not understand or appreciate their significance. One evening, as I sat alone among my collections, I picked up a small crystal paperweight that had belonged to Grandma Rose. It was nothing special by market standards, probably worth $20 or $30 at most. But I remembered the day she gave it to me, how it had sat on her desk, catching rainbows in the afternoon sun, how she'd told me it would always remind me that even the smallest things could create beauty when the light hit them just right. Tomorrow, Sandra was returning with contracts for the estate sale company and real estate agent. Tomorrow, the process of dismantling my life's passion would begin in earnest. And despite all her logical arguments and financial projections, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life, but it was too late to change course now. The momentum had built beyond my ability to stop it, and my daughter's certainty had overwhelmed my doubts. In trying to secure my future, I was about to destroy my past. And the woman who had once stood in wonder in her grandmother's attic was about to discover that sometimes the greatest loss isn't death. It's the slow erasure of everything that made life beautiful. The contracts were spread across my dining room table like a medical diagnosis I didn't want to receive. Sandra had returned with everything neatly organized in color-coded folders. Green for the estate sale company, blue for the real estate listing, yellow for the retirement community application, and white for what she called transition logistics. The efficiency was impressive and terrifying. "I've negotiated excellent terms with Timeless Treasures," Sandra announced, flipping through the estate sale contract. "They'll handle everything from sorting and pricing to advertising and conducting the sale. Their commission is 30%, which is standard, and they guarantee a minimum of 48 hours to clear everything that doesn't sell." 48 hours to clear a lifetime of collecting. The phrase echoed in my mind as I signed my name to documents that would transform my treasures into line items on a cash register receipt. Janet Morrison had explained the process with the same clinical detachment a surgeon might use to describe removing a diseased organ, necessary, beneficial, and ultimately for my own good. "The timing is perfect," Sandra continued, consulting her detailed timeline. "The estate sale is scheduled for the second weekend in February, which gives us 6 weeks to prepare. The house will be staged for showing starting the first week of March. I've already submitted your application to Rolling Hills Manor, and there's an apartment that should be available by May 1st. Everything was happening so fast. Just 3 weeks ago, I'd been living quietly in my beautiful home surrounded by my collections, and now my entire life was being reorganized according to spreadsheets and schedules created by my daughter. But I'd agreed to this, I reminded myself. I'd signed the contracts. I'd made the rational choice to prioritize security over sentiment. The sorting process began immediately. Sandra arrived each morning with coffee, energy bars, and what she called the plan of attack. We would tackle one room at a time, dividing everything into 4 categories: keep, auction, estate sale, and donate. The keep pile was strictly limited to items that could fit in the retirement apartment, had genuine sentimental value, and wouldn't require special maintenance or insurance. "Remember, Mom, you'll have maybe 600 square feet of living space," Sandra reminded me constantly. "Every single thing you keep has to earn its place." We started with the living room, which had always been the showcase for my finest pieces. The mahogany secretary desk was marked for auction after Janet confirmed it was a genuine Eastlake period piece from the 1880s. My collection of art glass was divided between auction and estate sale based on maker signatures and condition. The vintage lamps, throw pillows, decorative objects, and most of the furniture were designated for the estate sale. "What about this?" I asked, holding up a small ceramic shepherd that had belonged to Grandma Rose. It wasn't valuable by any measure, but it had sat on my mantel for 30 years. Sandra barely glanced at it. "Mom, it's sweet, but you can't keep every little thing that reminds you of Grandma. You already have her jewelry box and that crystal paperweight. This is exactly the kind of clutter you need to let go of." Clutter. The word stung every time she used it, which was frequently. My carefully curated collections had become clutter in her vocabulary, obstacles to efficiency that needed to be eliminated. Each item I wanted to save required justification, as if I were on trial for the crime of finding beauty in objects that had outlived their original owners. The dining room was even more painful. My 5 complete china sets were lined up on the table like defendants awaiting sentencing. Sandra had researched their market values online and presented me with printouts showing comparable sales on auction websites. "The Haviland should bring $200 to $300 for the complete set," she announced, consulting her notes. "The Spode could go higher, maybe $400 to $500 if we get the right buyers. The Depression glass is actually quite popular with collectors right now." She was trying to make the process feel like a business transaction, focusing on potential profits rather than emotional losses. But hearing my grandmother's wedding china reduced to dollar amounts felt like a betrayal of everything those pieces represented. This wasn't just tableware being liquidated. These were the dishes that had served countless family meals, held birthday cakes and holiday feasts, witnessed proposals and celebrations and quiet Sunday dinners. "You can keep one set," Sandra said, noticing my distress. "Which one means the most to you?" How could I choose between my grandmother's Haviland Limoges and the Spode Christmas set that Robert and I had collected piece by piece during our early married years? How could I decide between the Art Deco Noratake that had been my mother's pride and the delicate Lenox that had been our good china for special occasions? I picked up a cup from the Haviland set, remembering the weight of it in my hands when I was 7 years old, how carefully Grandma Rose had taught me to hold it properly. The roses painted around the rim were still vibrant after more than a century, their colors as fresh as the day some unknown artist had applied them in a French porcelain factory. "The Haviland," I said quietly. "I'll keep the Haviland." Sandra made a note on her clipboard, and just like that, 4 other complete china sets were condemned to be sold to strangers who would never know their stories or understand their significance. I imagined them scattered across different homes, maybe broken apart and sold as individual pieces, their careful completeness destroyed by people who saw them as mere dishes rather than family heirlooms. The kitchen was slightly easier because most of my everyday items were already practical and modern, but even there, Sandra found things to eliminate. My collection of vintage kitchen gadgets and serving pieces was deemed unnecessary duplicates of modern equivalents. The copper molds I displayed on open shelving were beautiful but impractical for someone who barely cooked anymore. "You're keeping way too much," Sandra said as we surveyed the growing keep pile. "Mom, you have to be more ruthless about this. Remember, you're trying to simplify your life, not recreate this house in miniature." But being ruthless about possessions that held decades of memories felt like being ruthless about my own identity. These weren't just objects. They were touchstones that connected me to different periods of my life, different versions of myself, different relationships that had shaped who I'd become. In the spare bedroom, we tackled my collection of vintage linens and textiles. Quilts, made by Robert's grandmother, tablecloths from estate sales, lace curtains that had hung in the windows of houses built when horses still pulled carriages down Main Street. Sandra held up each piece and asked the same question. "When was the last time you actually used this?" The honest answer was that I rarely used any of it. These were display pieces, meant to be admired rather than subjected to the wear of daily life. But that didn't make them worthless, did it? Museums displayed artifacts that no one used. Libraries preserved books that no one read. Why was my preservation of beautiful domestic items any different? "Mom, this stuff is just going to yellow and deteriorate in storage," Sandra said, folding a delicate lace runner that had been handmade in Ireland sometime in the 1920s. "At least if someone buys it at the estate sale, they might actually appreciate it and put it to use. Or they might use it as a dust rag, I thought, but didn't say." The idea of my treasured textiles being casually repurposed by people who didn't understand their craftsmanship made me feel physically ill. The basement was where Sandra's efficiency really showed. Robert's workshop, my gift wrapping station, boxes of holiday decorations, and storage containers full of items I'd been meaning to sort through for years were dispatched with swift decisions. Keep, donate, estate sale, trash. The categories were applied like medical triage, with no time for sentimentality or second-guessing. "Look at all this space you'll free up," Sandra said, surveying the cleared areas. "You've been maintaining all this stuff that you never even looked at. Isn't it liberating to let it go?" I wanted to feel liberated, tried to embrace the sense of lightness that Sandra insisted would come with downsizing. But instead, I felt diminished, as if pieces of my identity were being carved away with each box marked for disposal. The basement had been my repository of possibilities, where I'd stored things that might be useful someday, projects I planned to complete, gifts I was saving for the right occasions. Now it was just empty space that echoed with the absence of what had been. The process of selecting items for auction was handled by Marcus Webb, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who specialized in American furniture and decorative arts. He arrived with a camera, measuring tape, and the kind of reverent attention to detail that I'd been craving throughout this entire process. "This secretary desk is quite special," he said, running his hands along the carved details and examining the interior. "Compartments. Eastlake period, probably made in Grand Rapids around 1885. The proportions are excellent, and the condition is remarkable. I'd estimate it could bring $3,000 to $5,000 at auction, possibly more if we get competitive bidding." $3,000 to $5,000. I'd paid $75 for that desk at an estate sale in 1989. Drawn to its elegant lines and the way its numerous small drawers and compartments seemed perfect for organizing correspondence and personal treasures. Now it was worth more than some cars, a fact that should have made me feel vindicated, but instead made me feel foolish for not understanding its value sooner. Marcus moved through my house with the same careful attention, photographing and cataloging pieces that met his criteria for auction worthiness. A set of sterling silver serving pieces that I'd inherited from Robert's aunt, a collection of art, pottery that had caught my eye at various shops over the years, several pieces of art glass that bore the signatures of known makers. "You have quite an eye," he told me as he prepared to leave. "Many of these pieces show real discernment in the selection. It's clear you weren't just accumulating things randomly, but building a cohesive collection based on quality and aesthetics." His validation felt wonderful and terrible at the same time. Wonderful because someone finally acknowledged that my collecting had been thoughtful and informed. Terrible because it came at the moment when I was dismantling everything I'd built. "The pieces I'm taking for auction should bring a good return," Marcus continued. "I'll send you detailed descriptions and estimated values for insurance purposes. The auction is scheduled for mid-March, so there will be time for proper advertising and catalog preparation." After he left with a truck full of my finest pieces, the house felt hollow. Gaps appeared where treasured objects had stood for years. The mantel looked naked without its arrangement of art glass. The dining room seemed cavernous without the china cabinet and buffet that had anchored the space. "See how much bigger everything looks?" Sandra said, surveying the changes with satisfaction. "This is going to show so much better for potential buyers. People can actually see the architectural details and visualize their own furniture in the space." She was right about the space looking larger, but to me it looked wounded. The rooms that had once felt warm and inviting now felt sterile and anonymous. Without my collections to give them personality and warmth, they were just empty boxes with nice molding and hardwood floors. The estate sale preparation consumed the next 3 weeks. Janet Morrison and her team arrived daily to sort, clean, and price everything that remained. They worked with mechanical efficiency, reducing my life's accumulations to numbered tags and price stickers. Watching strangers handle my possessions with casual indifference was torture, but Sandra insisted it was necessary. "This is why we hired professionals," she reminded me when I winced at seeing someone toss a vintage tablecloth onto a pile without checking for damage. "They know how to process large quantities efficiently. If you tried to do this yourself, it would take months and be much more stressful." The night before the estate sale, I walked through my house one final time, seeing it as it would be seen by strangers in the morning. My dining room had been transformed into a display area for china and glassware, each piece tagged with a price that seemed either too high or too low but never quite right. The living room showcased furniture that would soon be loaded into trucks and driven to unknown destinations. Even my bedroom had been staged for sale, with linens and personal items priced to move. I went to bed that night in what felt like a hotel room rather than my own home. The familiar sounds of the house settling around me were different somehow, as if the building itself knew that everything was about to change. I lay awake listening to the wind in the trees outside, wondering if I would remember these sounds when I was living in the climate-controlled silence of Rolling Hills Manor. The estate sale began at 8 in the morning on a cold February Saturday. From my upstairs bedroom window, I watched cars begin arriving before the official start time, their occupants clutching coffee cups and scanning the newspaper advertisements that had brought them here. By 8:15, there was a line of people, waiting to enter my house and pick through the remnants of my life. Sandra had insisted I stay upstairs during the sale to avoid the emotional difficulty of watching my possessions being purchased by strangers. But I couldn't resist periodic trips to the window to observe the steady stream of people carrying my things to their cars. A young couple struggled with a rocking chair that I'd rescued from a barn sale in the 1990s. An elderly man carefully wrapped the Art Deco lamp that had sat on my nightstand for 15 years. A woman in a red coat emerged with several of my vintage purses clutched against her chest like captured treasures. Each departure felt like a small death. These people were happy with their purchases, excited about the bargains they'd found, completely unaware that they were carrying away pieces of someone's carefully constructed world. To them, these were simply objects with attractive prices and interesting vintage appeal. To me, they were memories being driven away in the back seats of strangers' cars. By noon, Sandra reported that the sale was going extremely well. The furniture was moving quickly, the glassware and china were popular with collectors, and even the smaller decorative items were finding buyers. The financial success should have felt gratifying, but instead, it felt like being congratulated on the efficiency of my own dismemberment. "You're going to have a nice nest egg from this," Sandra said, showing me the running tally of sales. "Combined with the auction proceeds and the house sale, you'll be very comfortable financially. This was definitely the right decision." I nodded and smiled because that's what was expected, but inside I felt empty. The financial security was real and valuable, but it came at the cost of everything that had made my house feel like home. I was trading beauty for safety, passion for practicality, and the exchange rate felt brutally unfair. By the end of the weekend, the house was nearly empty. The estate sale company had been as efficient as promised, clearing out everything that hadn't sold and leaving behind only the basic furniture I would need until moving day. The silence in the empty rooms was deafening, broken only by the echo of my footsteps on hardwood floors that seemed to remember where furniture had stood for decades. "Doesn't it feel good to have all that weight lifted off your shoulders?" Sandra asked as we surveyed the transformed space. "You can finally focus on your future instead of being tied down by all that old stuff." I wanted to feel the liberation she kept promising, tried to embrace the lightness and freedom that downsizing was supposed to bring. But standing in my empty house, surrounded by the ghosts of my dispersed collections, I felt only loss. The weight that had been lifted wasn't burden, it was substance. The stuff that was gone wasn't clutter, it was the accumulated evidence of a life lived with curiosity, appreciation, and love for beautiful things. The auction results came in 2 weeks later. Marcus Webb called with numbers that should have been thrilling. The secretary desk had sold for $6,800. The art glass collection had brought in over $4,000. The sterling silver serving pieces had exceeded estimates. In total, the auction had generated nearly $15,000 in proceeds. "You did very well," Marcus told me over the phone. "These were quality pieces that found appreciative buyers. You should be proud of the collection you built over the years." Proud, past tense. The collection I had built was now the collection I had sold, scattered to the winds like seeds from a demolished garden. The money was real and substantial, but it felt like compensation for a loss rather than reward for good judgment. Sandra was ecstatic about the financial results, seeing them as validation of her practical approach to my situation. The combined Proceeds from the estate sale and auction would indeed provide significant financial security for my retirement years. Added to the profit from selling the house, I would have enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life without worrying about expenses or care costs. But as I prepared to move into my small apartment at Rolling Hills Manor, surrounded by the few pieces I'd been allowed to keep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd sold much more than antiques and furniture. I'd sold the tangible connections to my past, the physical manifestations of relationships and experiences that had shaped my identity. I'd traded a lifetime of careful curation for the promise of simplified living, and the emptiness in my chest suggested that the exchange rate had been steeper than anyone had calculated. The woman who had once walked through estate sales with excitement and knowledge was now the woman who had created an estate sale of her own, and the irony was bitter enough to taste. The apartment at Rolling Hills Manor was exactly as advertised. Clean, safe, efficiently designed, and utterly soul-crushing. The beige walls seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and the industrial carpeting muffled every sound until even my own footsteps felt tentative and apologetic. The furniture provided by the facility was sturdy and functional, chosen for durability rather than beauty, comfort rather than character. I arranged my remaining possessions with the same care I'd always taken, but 27 pieces scattered across 600 square feet looked more like a sparse museum exhibit than a lived-in home. Grandma Rose's jewelry box sat on the dresser, dwarfed by the expanse of empty surface around it. The crystal paperweight caught what little natural light came through the single window, casting half-hearted rainbows on the neutral walls. The Haviland china set filled only 2 shelves of the built-in cabinet, leaving the rest glaringly empty. Sandra had helped me move in, her efficiency undiminished by the change of venue. She'd brought cheerful yellow flowers and a bottle of wine to celebrate what she called my new chapter, but her enthusiasm felt forced even to her. We both knew this wasn't a celebration but a conclusion, the final scene of a life that had been edited down to its most essential elements. "You'll make friends here," she assured me as we arranged the few photographs I'd kept. "Mom, you're social and interesting. Once you settle in, you'll wonder why you waited so long to make this change." But settling in proved more difficult than either of us had anticipated. The other residents were pleasant enough, mostly women my age or older who'd made similar transitions from family homes to managed living. They welcomed me politely into their routines of bridge games, television watching, and organized activities that felt designed to keep elderly minds occupied rather than engaged. "Did you have hobbies before you moved here?" asked Mildred Patterson, my neighbor across the hall, as we sat in the common room one afternoon. She was working on a jigsaw puzzle of a European castle, the kind of mindless activity that seemed to consume hours of every day at Rolling Hills Manor. "I collected antiques," I replied, then immediately felt foolish for using the past tense. "Oh, how nice," Mildred said without looking up from her puzzle pieces. "I used to garden, but you can't do much of that here. The maintenance staff handles all the outdoor work." Used to garden, used to collect. The conversations at Rolling Hills Manor were filled with past tenses, as if moving here required abandoning not just possessions, but passions. The residents spoke of their former lives with the resigned acceptance of people who'd been told their active years were behind them. The craft room that Patricia had shown me during my tour turned out to be a depressing space filled with kindergarten-level projects designed to accommodate arthritic hands and failing eyesight. Painting ceramic figurines, making greeting cards, with pre-cut paper shapes, stringing large beads into simple jewelry patterns. The materials were chosen for safety and simplicity rather than creativity or beauty. "We keep things manageable here," explained Dorothy Chen, the activities coordinator. "Many of our residents have physical limitations or cognitive challenges, so we focus on projects that everyone can enjoy." I understood the practical reasoning, but after decades of appreciating fine craftsmanship and historical artistry, these simplified activities felt patronizing rather than engaging. When I mentioned that I'd taught watercolor classes, Dorothy, brightened and suggested I might enjoy the monthly paint and sip sessions where residents copied simple patterns while drinking apple juice. The meals were nutritious and adequately prepared, served in a dining room that accommodated dietary restrictions and swallowing difficulties with the efficiency of a hospital cafeteria. Conversations at dinner were polite but superficial, focused on medical appointments, family visits that were too infrequent, and television shows that filled the empty hours between scheduled activities. "My daughter calls every Sunday," announced Evelyn Morrison, the woman who sat at my assigned table. "She's very busy with her career, but she always makes time for our weekly chat." "That's wonderful," I replied, thinking of Sandra's own weekly phone calls that lasted exactly 15 minutes and covered the same topics each time: my health, the weather, her work projects, and her relief that I was safe and well cared for at Rolling Hills Manor. But the most difficult adjustment wasn't the institutional meals or simplified activities or even the beige blandness of my new environment. It was the complete absence of discovery in my daily life. For decades, my days had been punctuated by small revelations, noticing new details in a piece I'd owned for years, finding an unexpected treasure at an estate sale, learning something new about the history or craftsmanship of an object in my collection. At Rolling Hills Manor, every day was identical to the last. Meals at scheduled times, activities designed for the lowest common denominator, entertainment that required no thought or engagement. The predictability that Sandra had promised would bring peace instead brought a crushing sense of meaninglessness. I tried to maintain connections to my former life by visiting antique shops in the area, but driving had become more stressful since the move, and most of the shops I discovered were filled with mass-produced vintage-style items rather than genuine antiques. The few real treasures I found were priced beyond my new budget constraints, and the pleasure of discovery was tainted by the knowledge that I had nowhere to display new acquisitions anyway. The financial security that Sandra had emphasized proved to be real and substantial. The combined proceeds from selling my house and collection had created a comfortable nest egg that eliminated worries about money. My monthly fees at Rolling Hills Manor were easily covered, with enough left over for small luxuries and the peace of mind that comes from knowing care costs wouldn't be a burden. But financial security couldn't fill the emotional vacuum that had replaced my passion for beautiful objects and their histories. Money in the bank was an abstract comfort that couldn't compete with the daily joy I'd once found in living surrounded by things I loved. The weekly phone calls with Sandra followed a predictable script. She would ask about my health, my activities, whether I was making friends and staying busy. I would report that everything was fine, that I was adjusting well, that Rolling Hills Manor was exactly what I needed. Neither of us acknowledged that these conversations felt like status reports rather than genuine communication between mother and daughter. "I'm so glad you're settling in," Sandra would say. "I sleep so much better knowing you're safe and cared for. You can just focus on enjoying yourself without all the stress of maintaining that big house and all those collections." Enjoying myself. The phrase had become meaningless in a context where my deepest source of enjoyment had been systematically eliminated. But I couldn't tell Sandra how empty I felt without seeming ungrateful for the security and simplicity she'd worked so hard to provide for me. 3 months into my residence at Rolling Hills Manor, I received a thick envelope in the mail from Timeless Treasures Estate Sales. Inside was a detailed accounting of the final sales proceeds, including a list of every item sold and its purchase price. Janet Morrison had included a note thanking me for the opportunity to handle such a quality collection, and mentioning that several buyers had specifically commented on the excellent condition and obvious care that had been taken with the pieces. Reading through the list was like reviewing an autopsy report. Each item was reduced to a description and dollar amount. Roseville pottery vase, pink magnolia pattern, sold for $85. Set of 6 crystal wine glasses, etched grape pattern, sold for $45. Mahogany plant stand with carved details, sold for $120. The total proceeds were exactly what Janet had estimated, substantial enough to make Sandra feel vindicated in her practical approach to my situation. But seeing my treasures reduced to line items on a sales report made me understand fully what I'd lost. These weren't just objects that had been converted to cash. They were relationships that had been severed, connections to beauty and history that had been dissolved for the sake of simplification. That evening, I sat in my small apartment surrounded by the few pieces I'd been allowed to keep, trying to recapture the sense of contentment I'd once felt when surrounded by my collections. But 27 objects couldn't create the same atmosphere as the hundreds that had once filled my home. The surviving pieces looked isolated and lonely, like the last guests at a party after everyone else had gone home. I picked up the crystal, paperweight that had belonged to Grandma Rose, holding it up to the window to catch the fading afternoon light. The rainbows it cast on the wall were smaller and less vibrant than I remembered, as if the magic had been diminished by being separated from its context. For the first time since moving to Rolling Hills Manor, I allowed myself to cry. Not the gentle tears of nostalgia or grief, but the harsh sobs of someone who'd made an irreversible mistake and was only now understanding its magnitude. I'd traded a lifetime of passion for the promise of security, and the exchange had left me financially solvent but spiritually bankrupt. The worst part was knowing that I couldn't undo what had been done. My house had been sold to a young family, who'd probably painted over the carefully chosen wall colors and rearranged the rooms to suit their modern needs. My collections had been scattered to dozens of different buyers who might appreciate individual pieces, but would never understand how they'd once worked together to create something greater than the sum of their parts. Sleep became elusive as I lay in the narrow bed that had replaced the antique four-poster I'd slept in for 20 years. The silence of Rolling Hills Manor was different from the familiar quiet of my own home, broken by institutional sounds like the hum of fluorescent, lights in the hallway and the electronic beeping of medical equipment in neighboring apartments. During those long, wakeful hours, I began to understand that Sandra's concern for my welfare had been genuine but misguided. She'd seen my collections as burdens that needed to be eliminated and problems that needed to be solved. But she'd never understood that they were also sources of daily joy, connections to beauty and history, and expressions of an identity that had been decades in the making. The irony was bitter and inescapable. In trying to protect me from the potential difficulties of aging with a large collection, Sandra had created a different kind of difficulty, the challenge of living with purpose and passion when the foundations of both had been systematically removed. I'd spent my entire adult life building something beautiful and meaningful, and in a matter of months, I'd allowed it to be dismantled in the name of practicality. The woman who'd once been able to spot a valuable piece of pottery across a crowded estate sale was now sitting in a beige apartment wondering how she'd been so easily convinced to give up everything that had made life worth living. The morning mail brought another reminder of what I'd lost. A newsletter from the local Antique Dealers Association included photos from a recent estate sale that featured several pieces I recognized from my own collection. The mahogany secretary desk that Marcus Webb had taken to auction was prominently displayed in someone's elegant study, surrounded by leather-bound books and oriental rugs that complemented its Victorian grandeur. Seeing my former treasure in its new setting should have made me happy. It was clearly being appreciated and properly displayed. But instead, I felt a stab of jealousy and regret so sharp it left me breathless. That desk had been the centerpiece of my own study for over 30 years, and now someone else was enjoying the satisfaction of its beautiful proportions and hidden compartments. The accompanying article mentioned that the piece had sold at auction for $6,800, nearly 100 times what I'd originally paid for it. The financial gain was substantial, but it felt hollow compared to the pleasure I'd derived from owning and appreciating the desk during all those years when it was simply part of my daily environment, rather than an investment to be liquidated. I tried to focus on the positives that Sandra constantly emphasized: The money from my sales had eliminated financial worries for the rest of my life. I no longer had to deal with the maintenance and insurance issues that came with owning valuable collections. My living situation was secure and comfortable, with medical care readily available if needed. But these practical benefits felt abstract and cold compared to the tangible loss of beauty and meaning in my daily life. Security and simplicity were valuable, but they weren't enough to replace the passion and purpose that had been edited out of my new existence. One afternoon, while walking through the lobby of Rolling Hills Manor, I paused in front of the display case that held donations from various residents. Mrs. Henderson's depression glass looked lonely and disconnected, a few scattered pieces that had probably once been part of a much larger collection. Mr. Torres's pottery was nicely arranged, but lacked the context and companionship that would have given it real impact. Looking at these orphaned treasures, I realized I was seeing my own future. Someday, probably sooner than I wanted to think about, the few pieces I'd managed to keep would end up in similar display cases, identified only by small cards that gave their basic descriptions without any of the stories that had made them meaningful. The thought of Grandma Rose's jewelry box sitting in an institutional display case, labeled simply as Victorian Walnut Jewelry Box, circa 1890, donated by Eleanor Whitman, made me feel sick. All the memories and stories and connections that had made that piece precious would be lost, reduced to basic catalog information for the mild interest of future residents who would never know what it had meant to the woman who'd treasured it. That evening, I called Sandra for our weekly conversation, but for the first time in months, I didn't stick to the usual script of cheerful updates and grateful appreciation for my new living situation. I've been thinking about some of the pieces we sold, I said carefully, especially Grandma Rose's china cabinet. I'm wondering if maybe I was too hasty about letting it go. There was a pause before Sandra responded, and I could almost hear her mental gears shifting from routine check-in mode to problem-solving mode. Mom, we talked about this extensively. You said yourself that you didn't have room for it at Rolling Hills Manor. I know we talked about it, I replied, but I'm second-guessing some of our decisions. I miss having my things around me. This apartment feels so sterile and impersonal. You just need more time to adjust, Sandra said, her voice taking on the patient tone she used when she thought I was being unreasonable. It's a big change, but you'll see that it was the right choice. You're safe, you're comfortable, and you don't have all those worries about maintenance and security anymore. Safe and comfortable. Those words had become Sandra's go-to description of my new life, as if safety and comfort were the only things that mattered for someone my age. But I was beginning to understand that a life reduced to safety and comfort wasn't really living, at all. It was just an extended form of waiting. What if I wanted to move back to a regular apartment? I asked. Something larger where I could have some of my collections again? Another pause, longer this time. Mom, that's not realistic. We sold everything already. The money is invested for your long-term care needs. Rolling Hills Manor is exactly what you need at this stage of your life. This stage of my life. As if being 68 automatically meant I should give up everything that had brought me joy and accept institutional living as my inevitable destiny. Sandra spoke about my age and situation as if they were medical conditions that required specific treatments, and the prescribed treatment was apparently the elimination of anything that might complicate my existence. After we hung up, I sat in my small living room, looking at the 27 objects that represented the remains of a lifetime of passionate collecting. They seemed to look back at me accusingly, refugees from a larger world of beauty and meaning that had been sacrificed for the sake of what other people thought was best for me. The truth was becoming impossible to ignore. I'd made a terrible mistake. In allowing Sandra to convince me that my collections were burdens rather than treasures, I'd betrayed not just my own passions, but the memory of Grandma Rose, who'd taught me to see beauty and value in objects that other people overlooked. But it was too late for regrets. The damage was done, the collections scattered, the connections severed. I was a woman who'd spent her life surrounded by beautiful things, and now I was sitting in a beige box counting the few remnants of what had once made existence meaningful. The woman who'd once been able to spot valuable antiques across a crowded sale was now the woman who'd let her own treasures be sold for a fraction of their worth, both monetary and emotional. And the hollowness in my chest suggested that some mistakes are too fundamental to forgive, even when they're made with the best of intentions. The phone call from Margaret Chen at Pemberton Auction House came on a Tuesday afternoon when I was sitting in the community room pretending to be interested in a television program about home renovations. The irony wasn't lost on me. Watching people restore and decorate homes while I sat in an institutional apartment stripped of everything that had once made my own home beautiful. Mrs. Whitman, I need to speak with you urgently about some items that were consigned to us through Timeless Treasures estate sales, Margaret said, her voice carrying an excitement that immediately made my heart race. There's been a remarkable discovery regarding their authentication and value. I excused myself from the community room and hurried to my apartment, clutching the phone with trembling hands. What kind of discovery? I managed to ask. Several pieces from your collection have been authenticated by specialists from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Margaret explained. Mrs. Whitman, you owned some extraordinarily valuable items that were significantly undervalued in the original estate sale. We need to discuss this in person as soon as possible. The drive to Pemberton Auction House felt like traveling through a fog of disbelief and growing dread. What if some of my most treasured pieces had been sold for pennies compared to their actual worth? What if Sandra's insistence on quick liquidation had cost me not just emotionally, but financially as well? Margaret Chen met me in the elegant reception area of the auction house, a space that reminded me painfully of the sophisticated environments where I'd once felt comfortable and knowledgeable. She was a woman in her 40s, with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from years of handling valuable objects and delivering life-changing news to their owners. Mrs. Whitman, please sit down, she said, gesturing to a leather chair across from her desk. What I'm about to tell you is going to be quite shocking. She opened a thick folder and pulled out a series of photographs that made my breath catch. In my throat, there was the Roseville pottery vase that had sold for $85 at my estate sale, now displayed against museum-quality lighting that highlighted every detail of its craftsmanship. Next to it was documentation from the Smithsonian Institution, identifying it as a rare experimental glaze created by the factory's master potter in 1904. This piece alone is worth between $15,000 and $20,000, Margaret said gently. It's one of only 3 known examples of this particular glaze technique, and yours was in pristine condition. $20,000. The vase I'd bought for $12 at a garage sale in 1987, the piece that had sat on my mantel for decades bringing me daily pleasure, had been sold to someone for $85, who then discovered its true value and consigned it to Pemberton for proper authentication and sale. There's more, Margaret continued, pulling out additional photographs. The art glass collection that had been scattered across multiple buyers at the estate sale included several pieces by Louis Comfort Tiffany that had been misidentified due to subtle signature variations. A small bowl that had sold for $200 was actually worth $35,000. A lamp base that had gone for $150 was valued at over $50,000 once experts confirmed its attribution. How is this possible? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The estate sale company said they knew how to price antiques properly. Margaret's expression grew sympathetic but serious. Estate sale companies are generalists, Mrs. Whitman. They handle large volumes of merchandise and don't have the time or expertise for detailed authentication of every piece. When someone has a truly significant collection like yours was, items can be drastically undervalued if they're not submitted for proper specialist evaluation. She pulled out more documentation, each page revealing another devastating miscalculation. The Depression glass collection that had been sold as a lot for $300 included several pieces by the Cambridge Glass Company that were worth thousands each. A seemingly ordinary ceramic figurine that had sold for $25 was actually an early Rookwood pottery piece worth $8,000. The secretary desk that went to auction performed well, Margaret noted, but even that was undervalued. Recent scholarship has identified it as being from the workshop of a specific cabinet maker, whose pieces are now selling for $15,000 to $20,000. The numbers were staggering, but more devastating than the financial loss was the realization of how thoroughly I'd been failed by the process Sandra had insisted was efficient and professional. The estate sale company that was supposed to know how to price antiques properly had essentially conducted a massive undervaluation that had transferred hundreds of thousands of dollars in value from me to buyers who'd recognized what they were purchasing. Mrs. Whitman, the total estimated value of the pieces we've been able to trace and authenticate so far exceeds $600,000, Margaret said carefully, and we've only been able to track about 40% of your original collection. $600,000. More than the combined value of my house sale and all the proceeds I'd received from liquidating my life's passion. I'd been sitting on a fortune and never known it, convinced by my daughter and the professionals she'd hired that my collections were worth only their sentimental value, plus whatever modest amounts they might bring at an estate sale. Is there any way to recover these pieces? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Unfortunately, no, Margaret replied. Once items are sold at estate sales, they become the legal property of the purchasers. Many of these buyers were knowledgeable collectors who recognized the values immediately. Some have already resold pieces at significant profits. Others are keeping them as major additions to their own collections. The room seemed to spin around me as the full magnitude of what had happened sank in. I hadn't just lost my collections. I'd essentially given away a fortune to strangers who'd been smart enough to recognize what the professionals had missed. The buyers at my estate sale hadn't been bargain hunters finding lucky deals. Many of them had been knowledgeable collectors who'd spotted tremendous values that the pricing had failed to reflect. There is one piece of potentially good news, Margaret said, pulling out a final photograph. This Tiffany Studios lamp was consigned to us directly by the person who purchased it at your estate sale. He's a collector who specializes in early 20th century American art glass, and when he realized the full significance of what he'd acquired, he felt ethically obligated to share the proceeds with you. The photograph showed the lamp that had sat in my living room for over 20 years, now properly lit and displayed to show its full glory. The base was bronze with an intricate pattern of leaves and vines, topped by a shade of leaded glass in deep blues and greens that created an almost mystical effect when illuminated. He purchased it for $450, Margaret continued. Our specialists have authenticated it as a genuine Tiffany Studios piece from approximately 1910, worth between $80,000 and $100,000. Mr. Harrison, the buyer, has insisted that you receive half of the final sale proceeds after our commission. $40,000 to $50,000 from one lamp. A lamp that had provided beautiful light in my home for decades, that I'd dusted weekly and enjoyed daily, that had been sold along with everything else because Sandra had convinced me it was just another piece of old lighting that could easily be replaced with something more practical. Mr. Harrison would like to meet with you if you're willing, Margaret said. He has a proposal that might interest you. James Harrison was a man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of keen eyes I recognized from my own years of searching for treasures at estate sales and antique shops. He met us in a private viewing room at Pemberton Auction House, where the Tiffany lamp was displayed alongside several other pieces he'd acquired from my estate sale. Mrs. Whitman, I owe you an apology, he said immediately upon our introduction. I knew exactly what I was buying at your sale. I've been collecting Tiffany pieces for 30 years, and I spotted several items that were dramatically underpriced. I should have said something at the time. His honesty was both refreshing and painful. Finally, someone was acknowledging what I'd begun to suspect. that knowledgeable buyers had taken advantage of the estate sale company's ignorance to acquire valuable pieces at fraction of their worth. I've made a very comfortable living over the years by spotting undervalued pieces at estate sales and auctions, James continued. But your sale was different. The quality and quantity of significant pieces that were mispriced was extraordinary. It wasn't just lucky finds. It was a systematic undervaluation of a museum-quality collection. He gestured to the pieces displayed around us. I purchased 8 items from your sale for a total of $1,100. Their authenticated value is over $200,000. I've made a good profit in my collecting career, but this felt like taking advantage of someone who'd been badly served by the people they'd trusted to handle their treasures properly. "What are you proposing?" I asked, though I was almost afraid to hope for any meaningful remedy to the disaster that had befallen my collection. "I'd like to make this right as much as possible," James replied. "I'm prepared to return 3 of the pieces I purchased to you at no cost. The Tiffany lamp, which we'll sell with proceeds split between us, a rookwood vase that your estate sale priced at $60 but is worth about $12,000, and a piece of Steuben glass that sold for $40 but is valued at around $8,000. The offer was generous beyond anything I'd dared hope for, but it also highlighted the magnitude of what had been lost. 3 pieces out of hundreds. A small fraction of a collection that had been built over decades and dismantled. In a weekend? "There's something else," James said, pulling out a business card. "I've been in contact with several other buyers from your sale. Word has gotten out in the collecting community about what happened, and there's been considerable discussion about the ethics of the situation. A few other collectors are willing to negotiate returns or profit-sharing arrangements." He handed me a list of names and contact information. These people purchased items they knew were significantly undervalued. They're willing to work out arrangements to share the benefits of their discoveries. It won't restore your full collection, but it might recover some of the most significant pieces. Margaret Chen had been listening quietly to our conversation, and now she leaned forward with another proposal. "Mrs. Whitman, we'd also like to offer you a position as a consulting appraiser for estate sales. Your knowledge and eye for quality pieces are exceptional, and what happened to you could be prevented for other collectors if estate sale companies had access to experts like yourself." The irony was almost overwhelming. The woman who'd been convinced her collections were worthless was now being offered a job authenticating and valuing other people's treasures. The expertise that Sandra had dismissed as outdated sentiment was actually a valuable professional skill that could prevent other collectors from suffering my fate. "I'd be honored to accept that position," I said, surprised by how much the offer meant to me. For the first time in months, someone was acknowledging that my knowledge and passion had value beyond mere personal satisfaction. Over the following weeks, the true scope of what had been lost became clear through Margaret's investigation and James Harrison's connections in the collecting community. My estate sale had become legendary among antique dealers and serious collectors, whispered about as the most significant undervaluation in recent memory. The total authenticated value of pieces that had been traced and confirmed was staggering. Over $800,000 in museum-quality antiques had been sold for less than $20,000. The financial loss was devastating, but the emotional impact was even greater. I'd owned pieces that belonged in museums, items that represented the pinnacle of American craftsmanship and artistry, and I'd let them be sold as household goods to anyone with $40 and good eyes. But not everyone who'd purchased my treasures was willing to share James Harrison's ethical approach. Several buyers refused to respond to attempts at contact, and others claimed they'd resold their purchases immediately and couldn't provide information about the current owners. The pieces that could be recovered represented only a small percentage of what had been lost. The Tiffany lamp sold at auction for $92,000, giving me $46,000 after commissions and James's generous split. The rookwood vase and Steuben glass piece that he returned to me were valued at $20,000 combined. 3 other collectors agreed to profit-sharing arrangements that brought in another $35,000. In total, I recovered about $100,000 in value from a collection that had been worth close to $1 million. It was a significant amount of money, but it represented less than 10% of what had been lost through the combination of expert ignorance and my own failure to insist on proper authentication before selling. Sandra's reaction to the news was complex and revealing. Initially, she focused on the positive financial recovery, treating the $100,000 as a windfall that proved her practical approach had been sound overall. But as the full magnitude of the loss became clear, her confidence in the decisions we'd made together began to waver. "How were we supposed to know?" she asked during one of our phone conversations. "The estate sale company said they were experts. They had good references and professional credentials. I tried to tell you some of these pieces might be more valuable than they seemed," I reminded her gently. "But you said I was being sentimental and unrealistic about their worth." There was a long pause before Sandra responded. "I thought I was protecting you from being taken advantage of by unscrupulous dealers who might try to convince you things were more valuable than they really were. I never imagined the opposite was happening." Her admission was as close to an apology as I was likely to receive, and I understood that her intentions had been genuinely protective, even if her methods had been catastrophic. She'd wanted to shield me from the complexities and potential problems of maintaining a large collection, but her risk-averse approach had created a different kind of disaster. The consulting work with Pemberton Auction House proved to be more fulfilling than I'd expected. Margaret Chen introduced me to a network of estate sale companies and auction houses that needed expert evaluation of potentially significant pieces. My first assignment was reviewing items from an estate in Portland that included several pieces of Northwest Native American pottery. "Your eye for quality and your research skills are exactly what this business needs," Margaret told me after. I'd identified 2 pieces that had been mislabeled and undervalued by over $15,000. Most estate sale companies are honest, but overwhelmed. They need consultants like you to prevent the kind of disaster that happened with your own collection. The work was part-time and flexible, perfect for someone my age who wanted meaningful engagement without overwhelming responsibility. More importantly, it reconnected me with the world of antiques and collecting that had been such a central part of my identity for decades. Using the recovered funds from my collection, I was able to move out of Rolling Hills Manor into a small house in Selwood, a Portland neighborhood known for its antique shops and arts community. The house was a 1920s bungalow with built-in cabinets, perfect for displaying collections and enough space for the pieces I'd managed to recover, plus new acquisitions from my consulting work. "Are you sure about this?" Sandra asked when I told her about the move. "You're giving up the security and convenience of Rolling Hills Manor for the complications of maintaining your own home again." "I'm trading security for purpose," I replied. "I've learned that being safe isn't the same as being alive." The house in Selwood felt like coming home in a way that Rolling Hills Manor never had. I arranged my recovered pieces with the same care I'd once taken with my full collection. But now each item carried additional significance as a survivor of the Great Liquidation. The Rookwood vase and Steuben glass piece that James Harrison had returned sat in places of honor, reminders of both loss and redemption. My new consulting work brought me into contact with other collectors and dealers who'd heard about what had happened to my collection. Instead of seeing me as a cautionary tale of an elderly woman who'd lost control of her possessions, they treated me as an expert who'd learned valuable lessons about the importance of proper authentication and valuation. "You've become something of a legend," laughed Patricia Williams, an antique dealer in Hawthorne who specialized in American art pottery. "Your story has made every serious collector in the region more careful about estate sales and more insistent on proper appraisals." The legend status was bittersweet. I'd achieved recognition in the collecting community, but it had come through spectacular loss rather than successful acquisition. Still, If my experience could prevent other collectors from making the same mistakes, perhaps some good could come from the disaster. One afternoon, while working on an estate evaluation in Lake Oswego, I encountered a familiar piece in the seller's collection. It was a small Roseville pottery bowl with a distinctive glaze pattern that I recognized immediately because I'd owned its matching vase for over 20 years. The vase had been sold at my estate sale for $35 and was now worth approximately $6,000 according to recent authentication. "Where did you acquire this piece?" I asked the homeowner, trying to keep my voice neutral. "At an estate sale about 6 months ago," she replied. The seller was an elderly woman who was downsizing. I felt a bit bad about buying it so cheaply, because it was obvious she didn't know what she had. The irony was perfect and painful. This woman had unknowingly purchased a piece from my collection and was now expressing sympathy for the elderly woman who'd been taken advantage of at her own estate sale. She was looking at me with pity for a situation she didn't realize I'd lived through personally. "Would you be interested in selling it?" I asked impulsively. "Oh, I couldn't," she said immediately. "It matches a vase I have that's quite valuable. They make a perfect pair." A perfect pair that had been separated by my own poor decisions and expert incompetence. The matching vase she was referring to was the one I'd lost, now reunited with its companion bowl in someone else's home, while I looked on as a hired appraiser rather than their original owner. But these encounters, painful as they were, also reinforced my sense of purpose in the consulting work. Every properly identified piece, every collector protected from undervaluation, every estate sale conducted with appropriate expertise was a small victory against the kind of ignorance and haste that had destroyed my own collection. Margaret Chen had been right about the value of my experience and knowledge. Within 6 months of starting the consulting work, I'd prevented losses totaling over $200,000 for various clients. Estate sale companies began requesting my services specifically, because my reputation for catching overlooked treasures had spread throughout the regional antique and auction community. "You found your calling," James Harrison told me during one of our periodic lunches to discuss the antique market. "You're using your tragedy to prevent others from experiencing similar losses. That's a form of justice, even if it doesn't restore what you lost." The money I'd recovered from my collection, combined with my consulting fees, allowed me to begin building a new collection focused on pieces I could properly research and authenticate before purchasing. But this time, I was selective rather than comprehensive, choosing items that spoke to me personally rather than trying to accumulate representative examples of different periods and styles. Each new acquisition was documented with detailed provenance research and professional appraisals. I created files for every piece with photographs, authentication documents, and detailed notes about their history and significance. If anything ever happened to me, Sandra or whoever handled my estate would have complete information about what they were dealing with. The relationship with Sandra gradually improved as she came to understand that my return to collecting wasn't a rejection of her practical concerns, but a wiser approach that incorporated both passion and protection. She visited my new house and admitted that seeing me engaged and purposeful again was worth the additional complexity of maintaining collections and property. "You seem like yourself again," she said during one visit, watching me arrange a new piece of art pottery that I'd acquired through my consulting work. "I didn't realize how much I'd missed seeing you excited about beautiful things." It was the closest she'd come to acknowledging that our systematic elimination of my collections had been a mistake, even if it had been made with good intentions. We'd both learned lessons about the difference between protecting someone and diminishing them, between simplifying life and emptying it of meaning. The house in Selwood became a gathering place for other collectors and dealers who appreciated having someone with both expertise and hard-earned wisdom available for consultation and conversation. Sunday afternoon salons developed naturally, with people bringing pieces for identification, sharing stories of recent discoveries, and discussing market trends and authentication challenges. "This is what your original house must have felt like," commented Dr. Patricia Chen, a retired art history professor who'd become a regular at these gatherings. A place where beautiful things are appreciated not just for their monetary value, but for their artistic and historical significance. She was right. The new house had the same atmosphere of discovery and appreciation that had characterized my original home, but with the added dimension of professional expertise and community connection. Instead of being a private refuge for my own collections, it had become a hub for education and preservation of decorative arts knowledge. 1 year after the phone call from Margaret Chen that had revealed the true scope of my losses, I received another unexpected call. This time, it was from the Portland Art Museum, asking if I'd consider donating my time to help with an exhibition on American decorative arts from private collections. "We've heard about your expertise and your unique perspective on collecting and preservation," explained Dr. Sarah Martinez, the museum's curator of American art. "We'd like to have you work with us on both selecting pieces for the exhibition and writing some of the educational materials." The exhibition, titled Hidden Treasures, The Art of Collecting American Decorative Arts, opened 6 months later with a significant portion of the content based on my research and recommendations. My own story was included as a cautionary tale about the importance of proper authentication and expert evaluation, though the focus was on education rather than personal tragedy. Standing in the museum gallery surrounded by pieces similar to ones I'd once owned, I felt a complex mixture of loss and satisfaction. I'd never recovered the majority of my original collection, and some of the finest pieces I'd ever owned were now scattered across the country in private hands or dealer inventories. But the knowledge and appreciation I'd spent decades developing had found new purpose in protecting other collectors and educating the public about the importance of preserving decorative arts. Sandra attended the exhibition opening, bringing her husband and teenage children to see their grandmother's work displayed in a professional museum setting. For the first time since Robert's death, I saw her looking at me with something approaching, the pride she'd once reserved for her own professional achievements. "I never really understood what you did with all those old things," she admitted as we walked through the gallery together. "I thought it was just shopping and decorating. I didn't realize you were actually studying and preserving important pieces of American art history." Her words were validating, but also bittersweet. If she'd understood the scholarly and cultural significance of what I'd been doing with my collections, would she have been so quick to dismiss them as worthless clutter? Would proper recognition of my expertise have prevented the disaster that had cost me so much? But dwelling on what might have been was less productive than focusing on what still could be. At 70, I had potentially 2 decades of useful life ahead of me, and I'd found work that gave those years purpose and meaning. The collections I was building now were smaller but more focused, and my understanding of their significance was deeper than it had been in my earlier collecting years. The consulting work continued to grow as word spread about my ability to spot valuable pieces that others missed. Estate sale companies throughout Oregon and Washington began calling me for evaluation of potentially significant collections, and my services probably prevented hundreds of thousands of dollars in losses for grieving families who might otherwise have unknowingly sold treasures for household goods prices. "You've become the person you wish you'd had when your own collection was being liquidated," Margaret Chen observed during one of our monthly business meetings. "That's a powerful form of transformation." She was right. The woman who'd been failed by professional ignorance had become the professional whose expertise protected others from similar failures. The collector who'd lost a fortune through improper valuation had become the appraiser whose knowledge prevented such losses. The elderly woman who'd been convinced her passions were burdens had become the expert whose wisdom proved that knowledge and appreciation were valuable assets that improved with age. The phone call from Pemberton Auction House had changed everything, but not in the way I'd initially hoped. Instead of recovering my lost treasures, I'd discovered that my greatest treasure had always been my knowledge and appreciation for beautiful, well-made objects. That couldn't be sold at an estate sale or liquidated for financial security. It was something I carried within myself, something that grew stronger with use rather than weaker with age. The woman who'd once stood in her grandmother's attic, enchanted by stories and beauty, was still standing. She'd been battered by loss and diminished by bad decisions, but she'd survived and found new purpose. The treasures were gone, scattered to the winds like seeds from a demolished garden. But the gardener remained, older and wiser and more determined than ever to help other gardens flourish. 5 years have passed since that life-changing phone call from Margaret Chen, and I'm sitting in my study in the Selwood house, surrounded by my carefully rebuilt collection. The room is smaller than my original study had been, but every piece here has been chosen with the wisdom that comes from understanding both the joy of acquisition and the pain of loss. Each object tells 2 stories now: its original history and the story of how it came to be part of my second collection, my deliberate reconstruction of a life built around beauty and meaning. The morning light streams through the windows, illuminating a rookwood pottery vase that I acquired last month through my consulting work. It's not one of the pieces I lost, but it carries the same sense of craftsmanship and artistic integrity that drew me to collecting in the first place. Next to it sits the Steuben glass piece that James Harrison returned to me, a bridge between my old life and my new one, a reminder that sometimes redemption comes from unexpected sources. My consulting practice has evolved into something I never could have imagined when I first walked into Margaret Chen's office. What began as a way to prevent other collectors from suffering my fate has become a respected expertise that's changed how estate sales are conducted throughout the Pacific Northwest. I now work with 3 auction houses, a dozen estate sale companies, and serve on the advisory board of the Oregon Antique Dealers Association. The files in my cabinet contain documentation of over $4 million in antique values that might have been lost to ignorance and haste if not for proper authentication. Each prevented loss feels like a small victory against the forces that destroyed my own collection. I can't undo what happened to me, but I can ensure it doesn't happen to others who've spent decades building something beautiful and meaningful. Last week, I received a call from a woman in Eugene whose elderly mother had passed away, leaving behind what the family assumed was a house full of outdated furniture and decorative objects. The preliminary inventory I conducted revealed several pieces of museum-quality American art pottery, a set of sterling silver from a renowned craftsman, and a collection of Native American baskets that belonged in a cultural institution rather than a garage sale. "You've saved our family from making a terrible mistake," the woman told me as we completed the proper authentication process. "We were going to call a general estate sale company and let them handle everything. We had no idea Mother had been collecting such valuable pieces." That conversation echoed dozens of similar calls I'd received over the years. Families who saw only clutter where treasures existed, children who couldn't distinguish between genuine antiques and reproduction, furniture, executors overwhelmed by the responsibility of liquidating estates they didn't understand. Each successful intervention felt like honoring the memory of collectors like myself who'd spent years carefully building something significant. The exhibition at the Portland Art Museum had led to other opportunities that continued to expand my sphere of influence. I'd written articles for antique trade publications, spoken at collector conferences, and even been featured in a documentary about the importance of proper estate management for decorative arts collections. The woman who'd once been dismissed as a sentimental hoarder was now recognized as an expert whose hard-won knowledge had value far beyond the personal. Sandra visits regularly now, and our relationship has evolved into something stronger and more honest than it had been even before Robert's death. She brings her teenage children, my grandchildren, who listen with genuine interest as I explain the history and craftsmanship of various pieces in my collection. They ask thoughtful questions about how I determine age and authenticity, showing the kind of curiosity about objects and their stories that I remember from my own childhood with Grandma Rose. "You're different now," Sandra observed during her last visit, watching me explain the significance of a piece of Depression-era glass to her daughter. You're more confident, more purposeful. Even though you lost so much, you seem more sure of yourself than you were before." She was right, though it had taken me years to understand why. The loss of my original collection had been devastating, but it had also forced me to examine what truly mattered about my passion for antiques. Was it the accumulation of objects, or was it the knowledge and appreciation that made those objects meaningful? Was it ownership, or was it the ability to recognize and preserve beauty wherever I encountered it? The answer had become clear through my consulting work. My greatest treasure had never been any individual piece in my collection. No matter how valuable or beautiful, it had been my ability to see significance in objects that others overlooked, to understand craftsmanship and historical context, to recognize quality and authenticity through years of study and experience. That treasure couldn't be sold at an estate sale or stolen by unscrupulous dealers. It was something I carried within myself, something that grew stronger rather than weaker when shared with others. The financial recovery from my lost collection had stabilized at about $150,000, a fraction of what had been lost, but enough to provide security and fund my new collecting activities. More importantly, the consulting income had given me financial independence and the satisfaction of meaningful work that utilized all my years of study and experience. James Harrison had become not just a business associate, but a genuine friend, someone who understood both the joy of discovery and the pain of loss that characterized serious collecting. We met monthly for lunch, sharing stories of recent finds and discussing market trends with the easy camaraderie of people who spoke the same specialized language. "You've accomplished something remarkable," he told me during our most recent meeting. "You've turned a personal disaster into a force for education and protection in the collecting community. That's a legacy that goes far beyond any individual collection." Legacy. The word had taken on new meaning for me as I'd moved through my 70s and begun to think seriously about what would remain after I was gone. My original collection had been scattered and lost, but the knowledge I'd gained from decades of collecting was being preserved and transmitted through my consulting work, my writing, and my teaching. The house in Selwood had become an unofficial education center where young collectors and dealers came to learn authentication techniques and develop their eyes for quality pieces. I held informal workshops twice a month, teaching people how to research provenance, recognize period characteristics, and avoid the kind of mistakes that had cost me so dearly. "You're creating a generation of informed collectors," Margaret Chen observed during one of these sessions, watching a young dealer practice examining pottery marks under proper lighting. "That's going to raise the standards for the entire field." The transformation from private collector to public educator had been gradual but profound. Instead of hoarding knowledge for my own benefit, I was sharing everything I'd learned with anyone willing to study and appreciate the decorative arts. The joy I'd once found in adding pieces to my personal collection had been replaced by the satisfaction of helping others avoid costly mistakes and develop genuine expertise. My relationship with beautiful objects had evolved as well. I still felt the thrill of discovery when I encountered an exceptional piece, still appreciated fine craftsmanship and historical significance, but I no longer needed to possess every beautiful thing I saw. Sometimes the greatest pleasure came from properly identifying and authenticating a piece for someone else, from seeing their excitement when they learned what they'd inherited or acquired. The Tiffany lamp that had triggered the discovery of my collection's true value had sold for even more than originally estimated, bringing my share to $52,000. But more valuable than the money was the lesson it had taught about the importance of expert evaluation and the dangers of assuming that emotional attachment couldn't coexist with financial worth. I'd used part of those proceeds to establish a small scholarship fund for students studying decorative arts and museum studies, ensuring that future generations would have the knowledge needed to properly identify and preserve American craftsmanship. The Eleanor Whitman Fund for Decorative Arts Education had already helped 6 students complete their studies and enter careers in museums, auction houses, and conservation. Grandma Rose would be proud, I said aloud one evening as I reviewed the scholarship applications, remembering the woman who'd first taught me to see beauty and meaning in objects that others dismissed as old things. She'd given me the foundation for a lifetime of passionate collecting, and now I was helping ensure that knowledge would continue to the next generation. The pain of losing my original collection had never completely faded, but it had been transformed into something constructive rather than destructive. Every piece I'd lost had become a cautionary tale that helped protect other collectors. Every mistake I'd made had become a lesson that prevented similar disasters. The personal tragedy had been alchemized into professional expertise that served a purpose larger than my own satisfaction. My new collection was different from the old one in fundamental ways. Smaller but more focused, with each piece carefully documented and properly insured. I kept detailed files with photographs, provenance research, and current appraisals for everything I owned. If anything happened to me, Sandra and her children would have complete information about what they were inheriting and how to handle it properly. But more importantly, the new collection existed within a network of relationships and knowledge that gave it context beyond mere ownership. The pieces I'd chosen were connected to the broader story of American decorative arts, to the artists and craftsmen who'd created them, to the historical periods they represented. They were part of an ongoing conversation about beauty and craftsmanship that I was privileged to participate in rather than control. The consulting work had brought me into contact with museum curators, auction specialists, and serious collectors throughout the country. I'd been invited to serve on authentication committees, contribute to scholarly publications, and advise on exhibition planning. The expertise that had once been confined to my personal collecting had found expression in the larger world of decorative arts scholarship and preservation. You've become one of the leading authorities on Pacific Northwest decorative arts, Dr. Patricia Chen told me after I'd helped authenticate a collection of pottery from the region's early art studios. Your combination of practical collecting experience and scholarly research has filled a real gap in the field. The recognition was gratifying, but more meaningful was the knowledge that my work was contributing to the preservation of regional artistic heritage. Every properly identified piece, every authenticated work, every prevented loss added to the collective understanding of American craftsmanship and artistic development. As I approach my 75th birthday, I'm aware that my active collecting and consulting years are likely numbered, but the knowledge I've accumulated and shared will outlive me, carried forward by the students I've taught, the collectors I've advised, and the professionals I've trained. The legacy won't be a collection of objects, but a contribution to the understanding and preservation of decorative arts. Sandra has begun showing genuine interest in learning about antiques and collecting, not because she wants to build her own collection, but because she wants to understand and potentially continue the educational work I've established. Her business, skills, and my specialized knowledge could create a partnership that would extend the impact of what I've started. I'm thinking about taking early retirement and helping you formalize the consulting practice, she mentioned during her last visit. You've built something important here, and it shouldn't end when you're ready to slow down. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The daughter who'd once convinced me to sell everything was now suggesting we work together to help other families avoid making similar mistakes. She'd come to understand that the problem hadn't been my passion for collecting, but our failure to approach it with proper knowledge and professional support. The house in Selwood feels like home in a way that Rolling Hills Manor never could have. It's filled with beautiful objects that bring daily joy, but it's also connected to a community of people who share my appreciation for craftsmanship and history. The isolation I'd felt during those months in the retirement facility has been replaced by purpose and connection. My story has become part of the oral tradition of the Pacific Northwest collecting community, told as both cautionary tale and inspiration. The woman who lost a fortune in antiques became the expert who helped others preserve their treasures. The victim of professional incompetence became the professional whose competence protected others from similar losses. You turned your worst experience into your greatest contribution, James Harrison observed recently. That's a form of alchemy that not many people manage to achieve. Looking back over the 5 years since Margaret Chen's phone call changed everything, I can see that the real treasure was never the objects themselves, but the knowledge and passion that made them meaningful. Collections can be lost, sold, or stolen, but understanding and appreciation grow stronger when shared rather than hoarded. The woman who once stood in her grandmother's attic, enchanted by beauty and history, is still standing. She's older now, marked by loss but strengthened by purpose. The treasures she accumulated over decades are gone, scattered to unknown hands and distant places. But the ability to recognize and preserve beauty, to understand and share knowledge, to protect and educate, those treasures remain intact and more valuable than ever. In the end, I learned that the greatest collection isn't made of objects, but of relationships, knowledge, and purpose. Those are the treasures that appreciate over time, that can't be sold at estate sales or lost to ignorance. They're the inheritance I'll leave behind, more valuable than any single piece of pottery or glass, more enduring than any cabinet full of china. The collector's true legacy isn't what she owned, but what she understood, shared, and preserved for future generations to discover and appreciate. That's a treasure worth more than any auction price. A collection that grows rather than diminishes when it's given away. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.